Woman's son punches veteran. Cops are shocked when they realize who he is. The son beat down on the crowded parking lot of the Riverside Strip Mall as Laura Thompson pulled her old Honda Civic into an empty spot between a pickup truck and a minivan. She glanced at her son Ethan in the passenger seat, who was busy scrolling through his phone, completely checked out from the world around him. His dark hair fell over his eyes, and his jaw was set in that stubborn way she'd gotten used to seeing lately. Before we can continue, if you love your family, subscribe to this channel to help up creating amazing stories. Now, let's continue. We need to get you some new shoes before school starts, Laura said, turning off the engine. The AC sputtered to a stop, and the late summer heat immediately started creeping into the car. And maybe a haircut wouldn't hurt. Ethan didn't look up from his phone. My shoes are fine, he muttered, even though Laura could clearly see the worn-out soles and fraying laces of his sneakers. And I like my hair how it is. Laura took a deep breath, counting to 5 in her head like her therapist had suggested. Ever since Mark's death 2 years ago, every conversation with Ethan felt like walking through a minefield. One wrong word, and everything would explode. She missed the days when he used to tell her everything, when a simple trip to the mall would have been fun instead of this tension-filled ordeal. Come on, she said, forcing cheerfulness into her voice. Let's at least grab some lunch first. I'm starving, and I know you didn't eat breakfast. Ethan finally looked up, and for a moment, Laura caught a glimpse of her old boy, the one who used to laugh easily and smile without thinking twice about it. Can we get burgers? Sure, Laura said, relief washing over her. These small victories meant everything these days. Big Bob's. Yeah, whatever, Ethan said, but he was already opening his door, his stomach apparently winning over his determination to be difficult. They walked across the parking lot, weaving between cars and shopping carts. The strip mall was packed with Saturday shoppers, families getting ready for the new school year, couples heading to the movie theater, and teenagers hanging out in groups, killing time like teenagers had done since the beginning of time. Laura watched Ethan from the corner of her eye as they walked. At 15, he was already taller than her, all awkward limbs and sharp angles. He moved with that teenage mix of confidence and uncertainty, trying so hard to look cool, while still figuring out who he was supposed to be. The black t-shirt he wore had some band logo she didn't recognize, and his jeans had holes that definitely weren't there when she bought them. Big Bob's burger joint was busy, the lines stretching almost to the door. The smell of grilled meat and French fries filled the air, mixing with the buzz of conversations and the clatter of trays. Laura noticed Ethan's shoulders tense as they joined the line. He'd never been good with crowds, even before everything happened. We can go somewhere else, she offered, but Ethan shook his head. It's fine, he said, pulling out his phone again. But his fingers tapped restlessly against the case, and he kept shifting his weight from one foot to the other. The line moved slowly, and Laura could feel the tension building in her son. It was like watching a storm gather on the horizon. You could see it coming, but there wasn't much you could do to stop it. She tried to distract him with questions about what he wanted to order, about the new video game he'd been playing, about anything that might keep his mind off the press of people around them. But Ethan's answers got shorter and shorter, his responses more clipped. When someone bumped into him from behind, Laura saw his jaw clench, saw the way his hands balled into fists before he forced them to relax. She reached out to touch his arm, but he pulled away, taking a step forward to put more space between them. That's when it happened. The line shifted forward again, and Ethan, distracted by his phone and his own brooding thoughts, took a step without looking. He collided with someone in front of him, an older man in worn jeans and a faded blue button-down shirt that had seen better days. The man stumbled slightly, but caught himself on the metal railing that guided the line. Hey, watch where you're going, young man, the older man said. His voice was calm but firm, the kind of voice that expected to be listened to. He had gray hair cut short and clean, and despite his worn clothes, there was something about the way he carried himself that commanded attention. Laura saw the moment Ethan's mood shifted from bad to worse. His face flushed red, and that familiar defiant look crossed his features, the one that always meant trouble was coming. Whatever, Ethan muttered, loud enough to be heard. Maybe you should watch where you're standing. The older man turned to face Ethan fully now, and Laura's stomach dropped. The man wasn't particularly big or imposing, but there was something in his eyes, a quiet strength that made Laura want to grab Ethan and drag him out of the restaurant before things got worse. "Excuse me," the man said, raising an eyebrow. "Would you like to try that again with a little more respect?" People around them were starting to notice the tension, conversations dying down as heads turned their way. Laura stepped forward, ready to apologize, to smooth things over like she'd been doing for the past 2 years. But Ethan wasn't finished. "Respect." Ethan's voice dripped with sarcasm.
"Yeah, right.
"Because you're so special, right? Just some old guy holding up the line." "Ethan," Laura hissed, grabbing his arm. "That's enough." But the damage was done. The older man's expression hadn't changed, but something in his eyes had hardened. He didn't raise his voice or make any aggressive moves. Instead, he just looked at Ethan with a steady gaze that seemed to see right through him. "Son," he said quietly, "I don't know what's got you so angry today, but taking it out on strangers isn't going to help." The reasonable tone only seemed to make Ethan angrier. Laura could feel him trembling under her hand, could see the way his chest was rising and falling too quickly. The crowd around them had grown silent, everyone watching the scene unfold like some kind of terrible street theater. "Don't call me son," Ethan spat. "You don't know anything about me." The older man didn't back down, but he didn't escalate either. He just stood there, calm as still water, watching Ethan with those steady eyes.
"You're right," he said.
"I don't know you, but I know anger when I see it, and right now, you're letting it control you instead of the other way around." Laura saw something flicker across Ethan's face, uncertainty maybe, or recognition. For a moment, she thought maybe the man's words had gotten through, had somehow pierced that armor of anger Ethan had been wearing for so long. But then someone in line snickered, and just like that, the moment was gone. The tension in the air was electric now, like the moment before a lightning strike. Laura could feel it building, could see it in the way Ethan's shoulders hunched forward, in the way his hands clenched and unclenched at his sides. She opened her mouth to say something, anything, to try to defuse the situation, but she knew it was already too late. Everything happened so fast. One moment Ethan was standing there, vibrating with teenage anger, and the next his fist was flying through the air. Laura saw it coming but couldn't move fast enough to stop it. The punch landed with a sickening thud against the older man's jaw, the sound somehow louder than all the gasps and shouts that erupted around them. The man staggered back a step but didn't fall. He brought his hand up to his jaw, working it back and forth as if testing whether it still worked. What struck Laura wasn't the hit itself, but the look in the man's eyes, not anger or fear, but something that looked almost like understanding. "Oh my God," Laura rushed forward, her heart pounding so hard she could feel it in her throat.
"I'm so sorry."
"Are you okay?" "Ethan, what were you thinking?" The restaurant had erupted into chaos. People were backing away, creating a circle around them like they were actors in some terrible play. Phones were out, recording everything, and Laura could already imagine the videos spreading across social media. Someone behind the counter was shouting that they were calling the police. Ethan stood frozen, his hand still clenched in a fist, but the anger on his face had been replaced by something else. Shock, maybe, or the first dawning realization of what he'd just done. He looked young suddenly, so young that Laura's heart ached. His tough guy act had crumbled, leaving behind the scared kid he really was.
I
didn't mean to," Ethan started to say, his voice cracking. He took a step back, bumping into the people behind him who quickly moved away. The older man straightened up, adjusting his shirt collar with careful movements. "Yes, you did," he said calmly. "You meant to hit me. The question is, what are you going to do now?" A burger joint employee, probably a manager from his name tag, pushed through the crowd. "Sir, are you alright? The police are on their way." Laura felt like she couldn't breathe.
Police. Of course there would be police.
Her son had just assaulted someone in broad daylight in front of dozens of witnesses. She grabbed Ethan's arm, partly to keep him from running, partly because she needed something to hold onto to keep herself upright. "Ethan," she said, trying to keep her voice steady, "you need to stay right here. You need to explain yourself to the officers when they arrive." The crowd had grown larger, people from neighboring stores drawn by the commotion. Laura could hear their whispers, see their judging looks. Some were still filming, and she wanted to scream at them to stop, to give them some privacy in this horrible moment, but she knew it wouldn't make any difference. The older man was still watching Ethan, but there was something in his expression that Laura couldn't quite read. He wasn't acting like someone who'd just been punched by a teenager. There was no anger, no demands for justice. Instead, he seemed to be studying Ethan with an intensity that made Laura nervous. The sound of approaching sirens cut through the murmur of the crowd. Ethan flinched at the noise, and Laura felt him start to tremble under her hand. All the bravado, all the anger from moments before had drained away, leaving behind a scared 15-year-old boy who was just starting to realize how much trouble he was in. "Mom," he whispered, and the fear in his voice nearly broke her. "Mom, I'm sorry." Before Laura could respond, 2 police officers pushed through the crowd. They moved with practiced efficiency, taking in the scene with quick, professional glances. The older of the 2, a woman with steel-gray hair pulled back in a tight bun, approached them first. "What's going on here?" she asked, her voice carrying the kind of authority that demanded honest answers. The crowd erupted with multiple voices trying to explain at once. The officer held up her hand, silencing them. One at a time. "Sir," she turned to the older man, "I understand you were assaulted." The man nodded slowly, still rubbing his jaw. "The young man and I had a disagreement," he said carefully. Things escalated more than they needed to. The second officer, younger and built like a football player, was already talking to witnesses and looking at the videos people had recorded on their phones. Laura could hear fragments of conversations, people describing how Ethan had been disrespectful, how he'd thrown the first punch, how the older man hadn't done anything to provoke the attack. "Ma'am," the female officer turned to Laura. "Is this your son?" Laura nodded, trying to find her voice. "Yes, officer. I'm Laura Thompson, and this is my son, Ethan. He's 15. She squeezed Ethan's arm gently. "Ethan, tell the officers what happened." Ethan stared at the floor, his face pale. We were in line, and I bumped into him, and..." He swallowed hard. "I got mad. He was trying to tell me something about being angry, and I hit him. I shouldn't have, but I did." The honesty in his voice surprised Laura. For 2 years, she'd watched her son hide behind walls of anger and defiance, but now, faced with the consequences of his actions, something seemed to have cracked open inside him. The female officer wrote in her notebook while her partner continued gathering statements from witnesses. The manager from Big Bob's had brought out an ice pack for the older man, who accepted it with a quiet thank you, but didn't apply it to his jaw. "Sir," the officer said to him, "would you like medical attention? We can call an ambulance to have you checked out." The man shook his head. "That won't be necessary, officer. I'm fine. In that case, I'll need your information for the report. We'll also need to know if you want to press charges." Laura felt her heart stop. Charges? Of course there would be charges. Her son had assaulted someone in public. She could see his future crumbling before her eyes. Juvenile court, a record that would follow him, college applications derailed before they even began. The older man was looking at Ethan again with that same intense expression. Something about the way he carried himself, the way he remained so calm in the face of chaos, made Laura wonder who he was. There was more to him than his worn clothes and quiet demeanor suggested. "Before we get to that," he said to the officer, "I'd like a moment to speak with the young man, if that's allowed." The officers exchanged glances. Then the female officer nodded. "We still need your information, sir."
"Of course," he said.
He reached for his wallet, and Laura saw something change in the officer's expressions as he showed them his ID. Whatever they saw there made them stand a little straighter, look at him with a new kind of respect. The female officer stared at the ID for a long moment before handing it back to the man. "Mr. Turner," she said, her voice carrying a new note of respect. "James Turner." "I apologize, sir. I didn't realize." James tucked his wallet back into his pocket, shaking his head slightly. "No need for that, officer. I'm just another citizen here." But Laura could tell from the way both officers were now looking at him that James Turner was anything but just another citizen. The younger officer had stepped closer, speaking in a low voice to his partner, and Laura caught fragments of their conversation. Army Ranger. Decorated. Silver Star. The crowd around them had thinned somewhat, though plenty of people still lingered, watching the scene unfold. The manager from Big Bob's had turned away other customers, leaving the restaurant eerily quiet except for the soft hum of the drink machines and the murmur of whispered conversations. Ethan stood beside Laura, confusion written across his face. He might not have caught what the officers were saying, but he could sense the shift in the atmosphere. The way everyone was suddenly looking at the man he'd punched with something close to awe. James seemed uncomfortable with the attention. He stood straight but relaxed, his hands loose at his sides, his expression neutral. Looking at him now, Laura could see what she'd missed before. The military bearing that no amount of civilian clothes could hide. The quiet confidence that came from facing things far worse than an angry teenager. "Officers," James said quietly, "if it's all right with you and Mrs. Thompson, I'd still like that word with the young man." The female officer nodded. "Of course, sir. We can give you some privacy, but we'll need to stay close by to complete our report." Laura felt Ethan tense beside her. "It's okay," she said softly, though she wasn't sure if she was reassuring him or herself. "Do you want me to come with you?" Before Ethan could answer, James spoke up. "If you don't mind, Mrs. Thompson, I'd like to speak with him alone. Just for a few minutes." Laura hesitated. Every maternal instinct told her to stay close to her son, to protect him even though he was the one who'd caused this situation. But there was something in James's eyes that made her trust him, a kindness behind the strength, a wisdom that seemed to understand exactly what was happening here. "Okay," she said finally. "Ethan, go with Mr. Turner. Listen to what he has to say." Ethan looked terrified, but he nodded. The officers directed them to a quiet corner of the restaurant where a few empty tables stood away from the curious onlookers. As Ethan followed James, Laura noticed how small her son looked next to the veteran, how young and lost. The female officer, her nameplate read Martinez, guided Laura to a spot where they could keep an eye on James and Ethan while giving them privacy. Her partner was still talking to witnesses, but most people were starting to drift away now that the excitement seemed to be over. "Mrs. Thompson," Officer Martinez said gently, "while they talk, I need to ask you a few questions." Laura nodded, unable to take her eyes off her son. James had sat down at one of the tables, gesturing for Ethan to take the seat across from him. Even from this distance, she could see the tension in Ethan's shoulders, the way he perched on the edge of his chair like he might need to run at any moment. "How long has your son been having trouble with his anger?" Officer Martinez asked, her tone professional but kind. Laura felt tears threatening to spill over. "Since his father died," she said, her voice barely above a whisper.
2 years ago.
"Mark, my husband, he was killed in a car accident. Ethan was in the car with him." Understanding flickered across the officer's face. "That must have been very difficult for both of you." "Ethan was so close to his dad," Laura continued, the words spilling out now that someone was really listening. "They did everything together, camping, fishing, working on old cars in the garage. After the accident, Ethan just changed. He stopped talking to me, started getting into fights at school. His grades dropped. I've tried everything, counseling, support groups, even talked about medication with his doctor. But nothing seems to help." Officer Martinez made notes in her notebook, but her eyes were sympathetic. "And Mr. Turner? Had you ever seen him before today?" Laura shook her head. "Never. But clearly you know who he is." The officer glanced over at James, who was speaking quietly to Ethan. James Turner is something of a legend in military circles. 20 years in the Army Rangers, multiple combat tours. He earned the Silver Star for heroism in Afghanistan, led a rescue mission that saved an entire squad trapped behind enemy lines. After he retired, he worked with veteran support programs, helping soldiers adjust to civilian life. Laura watched as James leaned forward, saying something that made Ethan look up sharply. She couldn't hear their words, but she could see the intensity on both their faces. "The irony is," Officer Martinez continued, "he's exactly the kind of person who could have really hurt your son if he'd wanted to. Instead," she shook her head admiringly. "Well, Let's just say your son might have accidentally picked the one person in this mall who knows exactly how to handle this situation. The younger officer, Williams, according to his nameplate, joined them, flipping through his own notebook. Ma'am, we've got statements from several witnesses. They all confirmed that your son threw the first and only punch, but they also noted that Mr. Turner remained calm throughout the incident. He glanced at his partner. Given Mr. Turner's background, should we call the DA's office? Officer Martinez shook her head slightly. Let's wait and see what Mr. Turner wants to do. Something tells me he's got a different kind of justice in mind. Laura watched as James reached across the table, placing a hand on Ethan's shoulder. Her son didn't pull away. The first time in 2 years she'd seen him accept physical contact from anyone other than her. Whatever James was saying, Ethan was listening, really listening, in a way she hadn't seen since before the accident. James studied the boy sitting across from him, seeing past the tough exterior to the pain underneath. The fluorescent lights of the restaurant cast harsh shadows on Ethan's face, making him look both older and younger than his 15 years. You want to know something interesting, Ethan? James kept his voice low and steady. When I was your age, I punched someone too. A teacher, actually. Ethan's head snapped up, disbelief written across his face. You? But you're like. I mean, they said you're some kind of war hero. I wasn't born a soldier, James said, a slight smile tugging at his lips. I was born an angry kid who didn't know what to do with all the hurt inside him. Sound familiar? Ethan shifted in his seat, his eyes darting toward his mother and the officers before returning to James. Did you get in trouble? For hitting the teachers?
Oh yeah.
Big trouble. But I got lucky. The teacher saw something in me that I couldn't see in myself. Instead of pressing charges, he made me join the school's JROTC program. Said if I was going to act like I wanted to fight, I might as well learn to do it right. James watched as Ethan processed this information. The boy's hands were flat on the table now, no longer clenched into fists. Progress, however small. The officers told me about your father, James said gently. About the accident. Ethan's face closed off immediately, his jaw tightening. I don't want to talk about that. Fair enough. We don't have to talk about it. But I want you to understand something. What happened today? That punch?
It wasn't about me.
And I don't think it was about my comment either. That anger you're carrying around. It's heavy, isn't it? Tears welled up in Ethan's eyes, but he blinked them back furiously. You don't know anything about it. You're right, I don't know your specific pain. But I know what it's like to be so angry that it feels like your skin can't contain it. Like if you don't let it out somehow, it'll burn you up from the inside. James leaned forward, his voice dropping even lower. I also know that letting it out the way you did today, that's not the answer. It just makes the anger bigger, gives it more power over you. A tear escaped despite Ethan's efforts, rolling down his cheek. He wiped it away quickly, but James pretended not to notice. The officers are waiting for me to decide if I want to press charges, James continued. You're 15, old enough to face serious consequences for what you did. One punch could change the course of your entire life. Is that what you want? No, Ethan whispered, his voice cracking. I'm sorry.
I really am.
I got so mad, and I couldn't stop it, James finished for him. Yeah, I know that feeling. But here's the thing, Ethan, you can learn to stop it. You can learn to control the anger instead of letting it control you. It's not easy, but it's possible. I know because I did it. Ethan looked up, meeting James's eyes for the first time since they sat down.
How?
First, by admitting I needed help. Then by finding people who could teach me discipline, respect, and how to channel all that energy into something positive. James glanced over at the officers, then back to Ethan. I'm not going to press charges. Relief flooded Ethan's face, quickly followed by confusion.
You're not?
But why? Because I don't think that's what you need right now. What you need is a chance to prove that you're better than what happened today. But that chance comes with conditions. Ethan sat up straighter, wariness creeping back into his expression. What kind of conditions? That's up to the officers and your mom, but I have some suggestions. Community service, for one. And maybe some time working with veterans at the local VA center, guys who know a thing or two about dealing with anger and loss. You mean like counseling? Ethan's nose wrinkled in distaste. James chuckled. No, more like learning some discipline. Physical training, maybe some martial arts. But you have to earn it. Show up on time, follow instructions, respect the rules. Think you can handle that? Something flickered in Ethan's eyes. Interest, maybe even hope. Yeah, I think I could.
Good.
Because I'm going to be watching. These officers know me, and they'll let me know if you step out of line. James's voice grew serious. This is your one free pass, Ethan. Make it count. They stood up together, and James noticed that Ethan's posture had changed. Less defensive, more open. As they walked back to where Laura and the officers waited, James could see the question in their eyes. Officers, he said clearly, I've decided not to press charges. But I would like to discuss some alternatives, if you're willing. Officer Martinez nodded, a knowing look in her eyes. We might have some programs that would be appropriate for the situation. Laura stepped forward, tears streaming down her face. Mr. Turner, I don't know how to thank you. Don't thank me yet, James said kindly. The hard work is just beginning. He turned to Ethan. Ready to prove me right about giving you this chance? Ethan straightened his shoulders, and for a moment, James saw a glimpse of the man this boy could become. Yes, sir, he said, and this time, there wasn't a trace of sarcasm in his voice. While James and Officer Williams discussed the details of potential programs for Ethan, Officer Martinez led Laura to a quiet spot near the restaurant's window. The afternoon sun cast long shadows across the parking lot, and Laura could see people still lingering outside, probably wondering how the drama would end. Mrs. Thompson, Officer Martinez said, pulling out a chair for her. Let's talk about what happens next. Laura sank into the chair, feeling the weight of the past 2 years pressing down on her shoulders. I don't even know where to start, she admitted. Everything I've tried. Nothing seems to work. He's just so angry all the time. The officer sat across from her, closing her notebook. This wasn't about taking statements anymore. This was about understanding. Tell me about before. What was Ethan like? Laura's vision blurred with tears as memories flooded back. He was such a happy kid, always laughing, always trying to make others laugh. Mark, his father, used to say Ethan could light up a room just by walking into it. She wiped her eyes with a napkin the officer handed her. They were so close. Mark coached Ethan's baseball team, taught him how to fix cars, took him camping. They had this tradition of watching old sci-fi movies together every Sunday afternoon, even when Ethan got older and started thinking he was too cool for family time. And the accident? Officer Martinez prompted gently. Laura's hands trembled as she folded the napkin into smaller and smaller squares. They were coming back from a baseball game. Ethan's team had won, and Mark was taking him out for ice cream to celebrate. The other driver ran a red light. They said he died instantly. Ethan was in the passenger seat. He had a concussion and a broken arm, but physically, he recovered quickly. Everything else, though. She looked across the restaurant where Ethan stood with James and Officer Williams. Her son was nodding at something James was saying, his face serious but engaged. It was the most attention he'd paid to any adult in months. The first few weeks after the funeral, Ethan didn't speak at all, Laura continued. Then one day, he just exploded screaming, throwing things, punching walls. The counselor said it was normal, that grief can manifest as anger in teenagers. But it never stopped. It's like he blamed himself for surviving when his dad didn't. Officer Martinez listened quietly, her expression compassionate. And you? How have you been handling everything? The question caught Laura off guard. Everyone always asked about Ethan, about his grief, his anger, his struggles. Nobody ever asked about her. Her voice cracked, and she had to take a deep breath before continuing. I miss my husband every day, but mostly I miss my son, the boy he used to be. Sometimes I look at Ethan, and I can't recognize him anymore. And I feel like I'm failing. Failing Mark's memory, failing as a mother, failing Ethan. You're not failing, Officer Martinez said firmly. You're still here, still trying. That counts for something. Laura watched as James demonstrated something to Ethan, a breathing technique maybe, from the way they were both standing with their hands on their diaphragms. I've tried everything I could think of. grief counseling, anger management support groups. Ethan refuses to go most of the time, and when he does show up, he just sits there in silence. The school counselor suggested medication, but Ethan won't even consider it. He says he's not crazy, he's just angry. Sometimes, Officer Martinez said carefully, kids need to hear these things from someone other than their parents. Someone who can relate to what they're going through in a different way. Like Mr. Turner? Laura asked, watching as her son actually cracked a small smile at something James had said. The officer nodded. We have a youth program at the precinct that pairs troubled teens with veterans and first responders. It's not just about discipline. It's about giving them role models who understand trauma, who've learned to channel difficult emotions into something productive. Do you think it would help? Laura couldn't keep the hope out of her voice. Ethan's always been resistant to any kind of program or therapy, but this is different, Officer Martinez pointed out. Look at him now. Mr. Turner got through to him in ways that counselors and therapists couldn't. Sometimes kids need to learn these lessons from someone they respect, someone who's been through their own battles. Laura watched as James placed a hand on Ethan's shoulder again. This time, her son didn't just accept the touch. He seemed to lean into it slightly, like a plant turning toward the sun. I just want my son back, Laura whispered. Not exactly like he was before, I know that's impossible. But just happier. More at peace with himself. Officer Martinez reached across the table and squeezed Laura's hand. This could be a turning point. Sometimes the worst moments can lead to the best changes. Mr. Turner choosing not to press charges, offering to help instead. That's the kind of chance some kids never get. Laura nodded, wiping away fresh tears. I'm so grateful for that. When Ethan threw that punch, I thought this was it. The moment where everything falls apart completely. Instead, it might be the moment where things start coming back together. Officer Williams cleared his throat, drawing everyone's attention. The restaurant was nearly empty now, the incident having disrupted the normal Saturday lunch rush. Only a few curious employees lingered nearby, pretending to clean already spotless tables. Mr. Turner, he said, given your background and your decision not to press charges, I'd like to propose something. He pulled out a business card and a brochure from his uniform pocket. We have a program called Veterans Leading Youth, VLY for short. It pairs troubled teens with military veterans for mentorship and guidance. James took the brochure, studying it carefully. His expression remained neutral, but there was a slight tension in his shoulders that Laura noticed. She understood his hesitation. He'd already shown extraordinary kindness in not pressing charges. Asking him to take on more responsibility for her troubled son seemed like too much. The program runs for 6 months initially, Officer Martinez added, joining the conversation. We've had remarkable success rates, especially with cases involving anger management issues. The structure and discipline seem to resonate with the kids in ways traditional therapy doesn't. Ethan shifted uncomfortably beside Laura, but she noticed he was watching James's reaction intently. There was something in her son's expression she hadn't seen in a long time. Hope mixed with fear. Fear of rejection, maybe, or fear of failing at something else. It's a significant commitment, Officer Williams continued. Weekly meetings, physical training sessions, community service projects. We usually meet at the community center near the VA hospital. All our mentors are volunteers, but they're also carefully screened and trained. James folded the brochure and slipped it into his pocket. And you think I'd be a good fit for this program? His voice was careful, measured. Sir, with your background and experience. Officer Williams paused, choosing his words carefully. We've seen how you handled today's situation. That kind of patience and understanding, that's exactly what these kids need. Laura watched as James turned to look at Ethan, really look at him. Her son straightened unconsciously under his gaze, like a soldier being inspected by a superior officer. It's not just about teaching them to control their anger, James said slowly. It's about helping them understand where it comes from, showing them how to channel it into something productive. He wasn't talking to the officers anymore. He was talking directly to Ethan. The program also includes family support services, Officer Martinez added, turning to Laura. Parent groups, counseling resources, practical assistance when needed. It's a comprehensive approach. Laura felt tears threatening again. family support. How long had she been trying to handle everything alone? That sounds... She had to clear her throat to continue. That sounds incredible. The thing is, James said, still looking at Ethan, it only works if both parties are committed. I don't take on responsibilities lightly, and I wouldn't expect you to either. He raised an eyebrow at Ethan. This isn't just about showing up. It's about doing the work, even when it's hard. Especially when it's hard. Ethan swallowed hard. Like, what kind of work? Physical training for one. Running, weights, maybe some basic self-defense, but only if you prove you can handle it responsibly. Community service projects. Learning about discipline and respect, not just talking about it, but living it. James's voice grew firmer. And yes, dealing with the anger. Really dealing with it, not just pushing it down until it explodes. The officers exchanged glances, clearly pleased with how the conversation was developing. Officer Williams pulled out more paperwork from his patrol car, returning with forms for everyone to review. There would be a probationary period, he explained. 30 days to see if it's a good fit. After that, if everyone agrees, the full 6-month commitment begins. Laura watched James as he read through the forms. His face gave nothing away, but she could sense him weighing the decision carefully. This wasn't just about one afternoon anymore. This was about taking on a troubled teenager, about investing time and energy into someone else's child. Mr. Turner, she said softly, I know this is asking a lot. He held up a hand to stop her. Mrs. Thompson, let me ask Ethan something first. He turned to her son. Why should I do this? Why should I invest my time in working with you? The question hung in the air. Laura held her breath, watching her son struggle with the answer. The old Ethan would have snapped back with something sarcastic, would have declared he didn't need help from anyone. But something had shifted in the past hour. Because... Ethan started, then stopped, gathering his thoughts. Because I don't want to be angry all the time anymore. But I don't know how to stop. And you seem like someone who figured it out. How to deal with stuff without letting it wreck everything. James nodded slowly. That's a start.
But I need you to understand something.
If I agree to this, I'm not going to be your friend. I'm going to be your mentor, and sometimes that means I'll have to be tough on you. There will be days you probably won't like me very much. Are you ready for that? The drive home from the mall that Saturday had been silent, but it was a different kind of silence than Laura was used to with Ethan. Instead of the angry, simmering quiet she'd grown accustomed to, this silence felt thoughtful, almost peaceful. Ethan spent the entire ride looking out the window, the paperwork for the mentorship program clutched in his hands. That had been 3 weeks ago. Now, Laura sat in her car outside the community center, watching Ethan walk toward the entrance for his 4th meeting with James. Her son's usual slouch was less pronounced, and he'd actually gotten up early to make sure he wouldn't be late, a small miracle in itself. The first meeting had been awkward. They'd all sat in a small office with worn furniture and motivational posters on the walls. James had laid out his expectations clearly. Ethan would show up on time, every time. He would follow instructions without argument. He would complete his homework and maintain his grades. Any fighting at school would end the program immediately. This isn't a punishment, James had explained, his voice firm but kind. It's an opportunity. But opportunities come with responsibilities. Ethan had nodded, trying to look tough but failing to hide his nervousness. Laura had watched them size each other up, her angry, hurting son and this calm, steady veteran who'd somehow seen something worth saving in him. The second meeting had been the hardest. James had made Ethan run laps around the community center's track, not as punishment, but as what he called moving meditation. Your body and mind are connected, James had explained while Ethan gasped for breath, hands on his knees. When you learn to control one, you start to control the other. Ethan had come home that day exhausted and sore, but he'd slept through the night for the first time in months. Laura had stood in his doorway, watching him sleep, remembering how he used to look when he was younger, peaceful, unburdened. The third meeting had brought the first real test. Ethan had gotten into an argument with another kid at school, someone who'd heard about the mall incident, and tried to provoke him. Instead of throwing punches, Ethan had walked away. He'd been shaking with anger when he told James about it, but there was also pride in his voice. You did good, James had said simply. That took more strength than fighting would have. Today marked the start of week 4, and Laura could already see changes in her son. Small things, maybe not noticeable to others, but to a mother's eyes, they were like miracles. Ethan had started making his bed in the morning. He'd cleaned up his room without being asked. Last night, he'd even sat at the dinner table with her instead of taking his food to his room. Laura watched him disappear into the community center before starting her car. She had her own meeting to get to, the parent support group that Officer Martinez had recommended. The first session had been overwhelming, sitting in a circle with other parents whose children were struggling. But there was comfort in knowing she wasn't alone, in hearing other stories of hope and progress. Inside the community center, Ethan found James waiting in their usual spot, a small gym with basic equipment and a boxing bag in the corner. James was already wrapping his hands, and he nodded toward the spare wraps on a nearby bench. "Today we learn about control," James said as Ethan started wrapping his own hands, mimicking the technique James had shown him last week. Power without control is just violence. Control without power is ineffective. You need both. Ethan finished wrapping his hands, remembering how the first time had been a mess of tangled fabric and frustration. But James had been patient, showing him again and again until he got it right. "Stand here." James positioned Ethan in front of the bag. "Show me what you've been practicing." Ethan took his stance, feet shoulder-width apart, hands up, just like James had taught him. He threw a punch, then another, focusing on his breathing like they'd worked on. "Better," James said. "But you're still letting anger drive the punches. Remember what we talked about. Technique first, power second. Anger just makes you sloppy." They worked for an hour, James correcting Ethan's form, teaching him combinations, showing him how to move with purpose instead of rage. By the end, Ethan was drenched in sweat, his arms heavy, but his mind felt clear. "You're improving," James said as they unwrapped their hands. "But the real test isn't in here. It's out there." He pointed toward the door. "How are things at home?" Ethan wiped his face with a towel, taking time to answer. 3 weeks ago, he would have brushed off the question or given a sarcastic response. But something had changed. Maybe it was the way James asked questions, direct, expecting real answers, but never pushing too hard. "Better, I think," Ethan said finally. "Mom, she seems less worried all the time. I've been trying to be around more, not hide in my room so much." James nodded.
Good.
"That takes courage, you know. Sometimes being present is harder than running away." Ethan looked at his mentor, seeing the understanding in his eyes. "Does it ever get easier? Missing someone?" It was the first time he'd brought up his father, even indirectly. James was quiet for a moment, respecting the weight of the question. 6 months had passed since that day at the mall. The community center's event hall was packed with families, police officers, and veterans from the mentorship program. Folding chairs faced a small stage where Officer Martinez stood at a podium, addressing the crowd at the program's graduation ceremony. Laura sat in the front row, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. The past 6 months had been a journey she never expected, full of challenges, setbacks, and moments of breakthrough that brought tears to her eyes. Beside her, Ethan sat straight in his chair, wearing a clean button-down shirt he'd picked out himself. He looked older somehow, more settled in his skin. "Our next speakers," Officer Martinez announced, "will share a story that exemplifies what this program is all about. Please welcome James Turner and Ethan Thompson." Laura felt her throat tighten as her son stood up, walking to the stage with James. Gone was the angry shuffle, the defensive hunch of his shoulders. Ethan moved with purpose now, with a quiet confidence that reminded her so much of Mark it made her heart ache, but in a good way, like remembering something precious instead of something lost. James stepped up to the podium first, his voice carrying clearly through the room. 6 months ago, I met Ethan in circumstances that could have gone very differently. He was angry, hurting, and looking for a fight. I know that place well. I lived there myself once. The audience was silent, hanging on every word. Laura saw several other teens in the program nodding, recognizing their own stories in James's words. "But sometimes," James continued, "what looks like an ending is really a beginning. What could have been a criminal record became a chance for change." What could have been another statistic became a story of transformation. He stepped back, making room for Ethan at the podium. Laura held her breath. Public speaking had never been Ethan's strong suit, and even with all his progress, she worried about how he would handle this moment. Ethan gripped the edges of the podium, took a deep breath, and began speaking. Before I met Mr. Turner, I was angry all the time. I thought being angry made me strong. I thought it protected me from feeling everything else, all the hurt and sadness I didn't want to deal with. His voice grew stronger as he continued. But real strength isn't about how hard you can hit someone. It's about knowing when not to hit. It's about facing your feelings instead of running from them. Mr. Turner taught me that, but he taught me a lot more too. Laura wiped tears from her eyes as Ethan talked about his journey. The early morning runs, the boxing lessons that were really life lessons, the quiet conversations that helped him understand his anger and grief. He spoke about learning to control his breathing when anger threatened to overwhelm him, about finding healthy ways to channel his emotions. The hardest part, Ethan said, his voice catching slightly, was learning that it's okay to miss my dad and still be okay. That being strong doesn't mean forgetting. It means remembering and keeping going anyway. James stepped forward, placing a supportive hand on Ethan's shoulder. Ethan's shown remarkable courage these past 6 months, he told the audience. Not just in the physical challenges, but in the emotional ones. He's learned to face his pain instead of fighting it. He's learned to be present for his family instead of pushing them away. Laura thought about how true those words were. Family dinners had become regular events again. Ethan had started sharing stories about Mark, funny memories he'd kept locked away for so long. Last weekend, they'd even watched one of Mark's old sci-fi movies together, and for the first time, they'd been able to laugh at the cheesy special effects without the laughter turning to tears. After the speeches, as people mingled and enjoyed refreshments, Laura found herself standing with James and Officer Martinez, watching Ethan talk with some of the other teens from the program. "Thank you," she said to James, knowing the words weren't enough but needing to say them anyway. "You didn't just help Ethan, you helped our whole family heal." James shook his head, smiling. "Ethan did the hard work. I just showed him where to start." He watched as Ethan demonstrated a boxing stance to one of the younger kids in the program. Sometimes we all need someone to remind us that our past doesn't have to define our future. Officer Martinez touched Laura's arm gently. "The program might be ending, but the support doesn't have to. We have monthly alumni meetings, continued mentorship opportunities." "I'd like that," Ethan said, joining them. He looked at James. "If you're willing to keep putting up with me." "Always," James replied simply. "As long as you keep doing the work." Laura watched as her son hugged his mentor. Not the awkward, forced hug of a teenager being polite, but a genuine embrace between two people who had walked through darkness together and found their way to light. In that moment, she could almost feel Mark's presence, could almost hear him saying that everything would be okay. And for the first time in a long time, she really believed it would be.
Disclaimer: this channel does not support or tolerate any form of discrimination, racism, prejudice, or violation of human rights. The stories presented here are original and created by the author with the aim of promoting reflection, awareness, and dialogue. All content is developed with respect for diversity and the dignity of all people.